Oh, faithfully conveying value and exploring the world's best books. Hi, this is Sally with Book Talk. Today, we're diving into the second part of the Newton biography. In the first part, we covered Newton's positive side, walked you through the big events of his life, and highlighted his key achievements across various fields. Many Newton biographies stop right there, but to get the full picture of this greatest scientist ever, just the good parts aren't enough. In this second part, I'll cover Newton's other sides, character flaws from his family background, and the backstory revealing his secret life as a theologian and alchemist. All right, let's start with Newton's personality to see his other side from this angle. As mentioned, Newton was a posthumous child, and his mom remarried when he was just 3. Although his mother returned after 8 years, this upbringing deeply affected Newton's young psyche. For instance, Newton always valued wealth and status highly throughout his life. He believed his mom left him to remarry for money and status, and that only with those could he feel secure. While at Oxford, Newton secretly ran a private bank, lending money to classmates and charging interest.
After getting his bachelor's, he rushed to the registry to snag the gentleman title, showing he distanced himself from the peasant class.
After 50, he went into politics and ran the mint because he figured science paid too slow. To get rich and climb socially, he had to switch gears. On top of that, his mom leaving him to remarry messed up how he viewed women, so he couldn't form close relationships with them. So, Newton stayed single his whole life and had no children. Newton's love life was always a mystery.
Some researchers think Newton had 2 close male pals. One was his college roommate, Wickens. They lived together for 20 years after graduation, till Newton left Cambridge for London. The other was a Swiss mathematician, 22 years younger.
Fatigue and Newton got super tight within months. They wrote letters constantly and bunked together on trips. But later, Fatio started blabbing, acting like Newton's mouthpiece and heir, even spilling his secrets, so Newton cut ties after 4 years. However, the childhood experiences affected Newton most profoundly in shaping his personality, especially in how he dealt with others. On the surface, Newton developed a quiet and introverted personality from childhood. His dislike for socializing gave him more time for reading, thinking, conducting experiments, and writing, which actually benefited his scientific research. But on the other hand, these experiences made him constantly suppress inner anger and become combative. Newton's surviving teenage notebooks record his youthful rage, including one from his university days at age 19, containing confessions about his childhood self.
The notes reveal he once threatened to burn down his stepfather along with their house.
In another notebook, Newton paired kinship terms with insulting words starting with the same letter, like father followed by F-word insults like fornicator and flatterer, brother followed by B-words like bastard and buffoon. This made Newton prone to adversarial relationships and extremely competitive. For example, when bullied by his class's top student as a child, he vowed to surpass him academically. Ultimately, he succeeded. Such a personality certainly helped his scientific achievements. But conversely, it also forged Newton's narrow-mindedness and highly aggressive character traits. He couldn't tolerate the slightest criticism and often held grudges over trivial matters. While he followed the principle of no provocation, no retaliation, he took, if provoked, retaliate to extremes. He would mercilessly strike back at anyone who offended him. This led Newton to accumulate numerous enemies throughout life, embroiling him in constant conflicts until they finally subsided. For instance, in the scientific community, Newton had 2 famous rivals, Hooke and Leibniz. Their feuds rank among the most notorious in modern scientific history. Robert Hooke was a renowned 17th century British scientist. 7 years Newton's senior, he shared Newton's extraordinary talent and dexterity, achieving significant accomplishments in mechanics, optics, and astronomy. For example, Hooke's law on elastic deformation bears his name, and he joined the Royal Society early as its laboratory curator. Scientifically speaking, Newton and Hooke did clash, like over light's nature. Newton backed the particle theory, while Hooke supported wave theory, meaning light is essentially a wave. Now we know light has wave-particle duality, so both theories had valid points. But beyond science, their bigger conflict stemmed from clashing personalities. They just rubbed each other the wrong way. Hooke's flamboyant, sociable nature really got under Newton's skin. Hooke thought Newton had zero taste for life and was always self-righteous and narcissistic. In 17th century England, papers couldn't go straight to journals. They first needed Royal Society approval. When Newton published his new theory on light and colors, Hooke was one of the reviewers. Hooke barely skimmed the newcomer's paper before slapping on a dismissive verdict. This massively bruised Newton's ego, starting their lifelong feud. First came fiery letters, then public attacks in Royal Society publications. Their battle raged till Hooke's death. Any new discovery by one would trigger all-out assaults from the other. They didn't care about truth, just finding flaws. Since Hooke managed the Royal Society, Newton threatened to quit and boycotted meetings for over a year. Though Newton stayed, he kept the society at arm's length during Hooke's lifetime. Even peacemakers got burned trying to intervene. Take Huygens, the Dutch scientist who proposed wave theory, just for suggesting Newton elaborate on particles. Newton saw it as Huygens backing Hooke, so he added him to his enemy list. Newton famously said something like this: "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." This is often mistaken for Newton's humility. Actually, it was pure sarcasm aimed at Hooke in a letter. Because Hooke wasn't just short, he was hunchbacked too. Newton wrote that specifically to mock Hooke. After Hooke died in 1703, Newton became Royal Society president and immediately erased Hooke's legacy. His only portrait vanished mysteriously. His equipment got cleared out. Yeah, Newton obliterated achievements of Hooke. Once called the Society's hands and eyes, Britain's Da Vinci, burying his scientific contributions for centuries. Royal Society members close to Hooke got blacklisted and purged by Newton too. While Newton-Hooke clashed over personalities, his Leibniz feud was about credit. Leibniz even died from the conflict. Leibniz, a famed German mathematician, philosopher, 4 years Newton's junior, earned the title Continental Europe's Newton. Research shows both independently invented calculus.
But Newton went ballistic hearing Leibniz used calculus resembling his fluxions, convinced someone leaked his work, starting their feud.
Many Royal Society members urged Newton to publish his math findings quickly. Newton refused, unwilling to fully reveal a discovery with disputed ownership.
But Leibniz didn't overthink it. When he published his calculus paper first in Germany, the conflict exploded.
Overconfident, Newton believed his idea was unique, impossible for another mind to have it, so plagiarism was the only explanation. His sole goal became crushing his rival, a battle lasting 40 years. It peaked in 1712. Newton formed a special committee in England to rule on calculus's true inventor. This supposedly impartial committee was just Newton's supporters putting on a show. Everything, investigation to report, was rigged. Members didn't even sign it before this 500-page report rushed out declaring Newton calculus's true inventor. Leibniz, naturally, fought back. He anonymously wrote counter-declarations and distributed them across Europe. But facing Newton, at the height of his scientific fame, Leibniz, stuck in the Berlin court and barely scraping by, was clearly no match. Even Leibniz's best friend, the scientist Bernoulli, refused to publicly offend Newton. Under these multiple blows, Leibniz fell ill and soon passed away, bringing the feud to an end. Later generations gave a fairer judgment on the calculus invention dispute. Newton and Leibniz independently invented calculus. In fact, Leibniz's calculus notation was more convenient and practical than Newton's fluxions, and it's still used today. But the British math community stubbornly resisted this, causing British math, once 50 years ahead of continental Europe in Newton's era, to gradually fall behind over the next century. And if Hooke and Leibniz were opponents of equal caliber to Newton, then the Royal Astronomical Society's observer Flamsteed wasn't a true rival at all. Yet Newton didn't spare him either. Flamsteed was tasked with providing Newton precise lunar observation data to verify the law of universal gravitation. Because his data processing had errors and his words weren't humble enough, he angered Newton. So Newton began relentlessly mocking and attacking this minor figure.
Although Flamsteed respected Newton, he couldn't tolerate Newton's baseless accusations, so they fell out.
Newton used his power to ruin Flamsteed's reputation until his death. He also completely erased Flamsteed's name as the data provider from all books. Hearing this, you might be surprised, but Newton was exactly the kind to crush perceived opponents to death, especially later in life after achieving fame. Those around him feared angering him, even Halley, who helped publish his Principia Mathematica. Once, when Halley provided Newton with incorrect data, he panicked and hastily wrote a letter apologizing profusely in the humblest tone. Even esteemed council members of the Royal Society were occasionally kicked out for offending him. In his later years, Newton not only couldn't tolerate the slightest offense from others, but also dedicated himself to shaping and maintaining his own positive image. Especially after he was knighted, like Newton's parents conceived him before marriage.
He saw this as a stain and deliberately moved his parents' marriage date forward by 2 years.
Additionally, in his later years, Newton burned many documents and letters that could harm his reputation. All right, so far we've covered Newton's other side. Personality-wise, he wasn't perfect, which affected his personal relationships and emotional life. A person's front and sides are easily visible, but their back is rarely shown to the world. We often say that the opposite of science is religion and witchcraft, but it's hard to imagine that Newton, as a scientist, was also a theologian and alchemist. Identities he mostly hid, yet they were lifelong pursuits. So how did these seemingly contradictory identities coexist? First, let's discuss Newton as a theologian. Many believe modern science emerged from fighting religious constraints, and their conflict is irreconcilable. For example, Italian scientist Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for supporting Copernicus's heliocentric theory in Rome's Campo dei Fiori. But this was just an extreme case. In the 17th century, when Newton lived, Christianity was the faith of most Europeans and many scientists. Faith, the existence of God, doesn't affect scientific research and discoveries because science explores truths of the objective world. From an atheist's view, such truths are completely objective. But, for those who believe in God, the truths of the objective world are decreed by God outside it. Studying science is a way to approach God and isn't in conflict with executing God's will. Newton was a devout Puritan from childhood. Puritans were reformers in England after the European Reformation, demanding elimination of traditional Catholic rituals. They emphasized equality before God and opposed bishops and aristocrats who held privileges in religion's name. This naturally angered the English ruling class, leading to persecution and arrests of many Puritans. So many Puritans, including Newton, practiced their faith in secret.
Such faith forced Newton to be extremely careful to avoid persecution if his beliefs were exposed.
But this didn't affect Newton's reverence for God and the Bible. In his later years, Newton devoted most of his energy to theological research. Newton believed that the laws governing all things in the universe must have been established by a perfect God. For example, he was obsessed with chronology, specifically dating the events recorded in the Bible. This work spanned 50 years with constant revisions. He believed that God creating the world in 7 days was true, but due to changes in Earth's rotation speed, a day back then differed in length from today. He also researched the prophecies in the Bible.
According to his calculations, the second coming of Christ, also known as the final judgment, would occur in 1948.
And the last judgment would take place between 2370 and 2436, marking the end of the Christian era. And if Newton saw scientific and theological studies as ways to approach God, that's somewhat understandable. Then why, as a scientist, was he obsessed with alchemy, which was seen as witchcraft? Now, let's explore alchemy together. In ancient times, it was popular in both China and Europe for millennia, using chemical agents like mercury and sulfur to produce gold or other elixirs, such as immortality pills.
The alchemical process involved complex procedures, with furnaces often kept burning for months or even years.
In Newton's time, alchemy was somewhat similar to early chemistry, studying reactions between various substances. However, their directions differed. Chemistry's fundamental idea was to study the objective laws of reactions. Alchemy was different. It relied on mystical forces, like using subjective will to obtain unexpected substances. But no alchemist ever truly transformed materials into gold over millennia. But it was this obsession with the mystical that drew countless people into it for centuries, even to fanaticism. In Newton's era, alchemy was banned, partly because it deluded people without producing real gold, and partly because alchemy was highly dangerous. Not only did it release toxic gases that could kill, but it also frequently caused fires. Therefore, Newton's identity as an alchemist was always carefully concealed. Newton's teacher, Barrow, we mentioned earlier, was an alchemy enthusiast. Under their influence, Newton began exploring alchemy. Meanwhile, Robert Boyle, a key figure in the Royal Society and renowned British chemist, also passionately pursued alchemy, holding a distinguished place in chemistry history. He authored The Skeptical Chemist, and it was with him that chemistry truly became a science.
However, chemist was Boyle's public identity. Secretly, he was also an alchemist, seeking both objective chemical laws and that mysterious force.
Newton was the same. He firmly believed mysterious forces existed. Though countless had failed over millennia, he believed such forces could eventually be mastered. Newton secretly conducted alchemical experiments throughout his life. He never made gold, but this seemingly pseudoscientific pursuit drove his great scientific achievements. In fact, Newton incorporated this concept of mysterious forces into his physics system. Gravity itself is essentially a mysterious force. Today, the mutual attraction between massive objects is an ingrained concept for us. But think carefully. How does force transmit between Earth and Sun across such vast distances?
This is a profound question.
By introducing the mysterious force of gravity, Newton explained celestial motion and laid modern physics' foundation. Thus, the author suggests Newton's law of universal gravitation emerged less from an apple's inspiration and more from his alchemy-driven, deep-rooted belief in mysterious forces, gradually shaping this world-changing theory. To protect Newton's image, his alchemy obsession remained well concealed. After his death, his niece Catherine kept silent until 20th century alchemy manuscript discoveries revealed Newton's hidden identity. This concludes Newton's hidden side. As theologian and alchemist, these seemingly contradictory identities actually fueled his scientific brilliance. And with that, we've covered the main content of the Newton biography. In truth, each of us may have different facets and play various roles. Even the great scientist Newton was no exception. Today's exploration of this Newton biography has allowed you to rediscover him through multiple dimensions. This extraordinary scientist, he possessed both the brilliant, often mentioned public image and his character flaws with hidden identities. Yet, this is precisely what formed a complete flesh and blood Newton. So how did Newton view himself? He left this famous quote during his lifetime: "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, diverting myself in now, and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." That concludes our interpretation of Newton's biography. Find show notes below the audio. See you next time.